But if James Hunter found the professor enigmatic, Rockman didn't like him at all. The banker gave him a lukewarm reception when he was introduced to the committee, eyed him uncomfortably when he took his seat, and when he mentioned debt-free credit, Rockman's eyes lit up in amazement. A fierce argument followed in which Rockman and the rest of the committee, which by the President and Professor Maloney was made up entirely of lapdogs, subjected the academic to an hysterical verbal assault. Did he realise what he was suggesting? Nothing like this had ever been done in the history of economics. This was lunacy. Debt-free money? What would he suggest next? James Hunter was surprised at the intensity of the onslaught, and even more surprised at the hollowness of the arguments, which seemed to him nothing less and nothing more than vicious ad hominem attacks on the Professor. At one point, Simons, who was Rockman's PR man, suggested that the Professor was a fascist sympathiser, because this system of economics was similar to that which had been proposed by Gottfried Frege, the author of the Nazi Party's manifesto. Maloney dismissed the insult with a shrug of his shoulders. In the first place, this is nothing to do with fascist or Nazi economics. As far as I'm aware, as soon as Hitler seized power, he dismissed the ideas of Gottfried Frege and resorted to a programme of public works within the framework of a conventional economic system. In the second place, just because the Nazis or any other group of fascists or crackpots once practised or preached a certain economic policy, or any social policy, doesn't mean it's a bad policy per se. Hitler was also opposed to vivisection. In the third place, as my wife is the granddaughter of a reformed rabbi, I take exception to any suggestion that I am somehow sympathetic to any aspect of fascism. James Hunter had not spoken much during this debate, nor did he want to. It would be unwise, he felt, to come up too strongly in the Professor's support, so he decided to act dumb, but thought it might be a good idea to suggest that the committee sleep on it. Listen, gentlemen, I think this discussion is getting a little too charged with emotion, he interjected. I must confess that I don't for the life of me understand the Professor's theories, nor yours for that matter. I am only a humble President of the United States when all is said and done, but I do think we ought to consider all possibilities. I wonder therefore if I might ask the Professor to submit a written report for the next meeting. Turning to Professor Maloney, he added, have you any objection to that, Professor? And is there anything in particular you would like us to consider? Thank you, Mr. President, he said. I would like the committee to consider the direct issue of credit debt-free to the general public and the abolition of the Federal Reserve System. There followed what can only be described as a pregnant silence, but the delivery never arrived. Rockman bowed his head in contemplation, and when he looked up he said, well, gentlemen, it's getting late and I have to be elsewhere. I'm sure you all do. Mr. President? Yes, said James Hunter. I suggest we meet here in 2 weeks and consider the Professor's report. And any other suggestions any of you would like to make. Mr. President? James Hunter turned to him bewildered. Have you any suggestions to make? Only that I think your suggestion is sound, and I think that the committee should consider any proposals anyone proposes. That's fine then, said Rockman. Gentlemen, I think that will be all. It was certainly all for Professor Maloney, because 3 days later South rang the President in the middle of the night to drop a bombshell. The academic had been arrested for indecently assaulting a tourist in a public toilet in New York. Good grief, said James Hunter, are you sure? Sure about the indecent assault? Of course I'm sure, sir. This is a fit-up. Yes, of course, he replied, now fully convinced that South's cranky conspiracy theory was anything but cranky. Rockman, he said. Ever since that fateful meeting with South and Professor Maloney, he'd seen the hidden hand of David Rockman behind every financial development in the United States for the past 10 years, bad and good. He wondered if it were true what South had told him about bankers creating boom and bust cycles in order to enrich themselves at public expense, and decided it must be at least partially true. It certainly sounds like Rockman, sir. The Professor is a bit eccentric, but he's a married man and he's certainly no faggot. What do you want me to do, he asked. I don't want you to do anything, sir. If Rockman decides you're behind this, I dread to think what will happen. But what are we going to do about the Professor? Rockman and his stooges will obviously use this to try to discredit all his ideas. I want you to give me a week's leave of absence, Mr. President. This is a fine time to be taking a holiday, Colonel. I wasn't planning on that, sir. What I want is to check this allegation out. I haven't got any details on the tourist yet. Well, I've got a friend who works for the New York Police Department, and he owes me a favour. Oh, I see. When did this alleged assault happen, he asked. This afternoon, sir. The Professor has just been bailed by NYPD. And do the press know? That is what is called an academic question, sir. Yes, I suppose it would be. It would be too late to keep it out of the papers then. There's no chance of that at all. It's already been on TV. Something like senior government financial advisor arrested for indecency. Oh hell. Fortunately they hadn't said that he was the President's choice. Yet, Colonel. Precisely so. I would suggest that when Rockman phoned you express disgust and demand that the Professor be dismissed from the committee forthwith. In the meantime I'll get on to my friend in NYPD and the Professor himself. Good thinking, Colonel, said the President. In fact, I think I'll phone Rockman myself now. Very good, Mr. President. And Oscar? Yes, Mr. President. Whatever you do in New York, whatever you, your friend and the Professor get up to, I don't want to know. Is that understood? Yes, sir. As soon as he put down the phone on Oscar South, James Hunter phoned David Rockman, who was still in Washington, where he seemed to spend an increasing amount of his time nowadays, probably to keep his beady eye on him, he thought, gloomily. Rockman had just gone to bed and was obviously not pleased to be disturbed at such an hour, even by the President of the United States, but his brusque tone mellowed almost visibly as James Hunter told him what had happened, and then proceeded to denounce the Professor as a damn faggot, quack, funny money pseudo-economist. How on earth did I ever get talked into endorsing someone like this, he shrieked. When this gets out, it'll ruin me. David, I can't take me back for this. Of course not, Mr. President. We can all make mistakes, and no one will hold it against you that you appointed a man to an important committee who, well... But that's not enough, David, he said. God, I have to totally absolve myself of this man, wash my hands of him completely, or I'll be forced to do what Oscar South said. And what did Oscar South say, asked Rockman. That I'll have to hand the running of the committee over to a team from the Professor's University. There's no need for that, Mr. President. But David, I have to dissociate myself from Professor Maloney totally, or I won't be able to go on. The fact that he was appointed by the President will reflect far, far worse on me than it would if you had appointed him, for argument's sake. I'm sure that's not true, Mr. President. Well, it is, David. Why, if you had appointed him, no one would bat an eyelid. James Hunter tried not to make this sound like a hint. Rockman was the sort of person who was vain enough to steal somebody else's idea in order to pass it off as his own. And sure enough, that was what he did. The following day, Rockman issued a brief press statement to say that he regretted having appointed Professor Maloney to the committee. He couldn't, of course, comment on the case as he believed the Professor was vehemently denying the charge, but in any case he had been in need of arrest, and he would ask the advice of the President when it came to appointing a new chief economist. Meanwhile, in New York, Oscar South had traced the tourist who had accused the Professor of indecent assault. The man was an accountant who worked for a small firm in Manchester, England. South decided it might be worth a trip to England to check out both his background and the man's company. He also interviewed the Professor, who swore that he was not any sort of faggot, and even if he were, he was certainly not have tried it on with a stranger and a tourist at that in a public toilet. There are bathhouses and places where these sort of people meet, he said, clearly revolted at the very thought of any sexual contact with another man. South told him he believed him, and that the Professor had obviously been fitted up by the conspiracy. This is something which has gone on throughout history, he said. You think the Illuminati is behind it, asked the Professor? No, said the Colonel. David Rockman. South took the next available flight to Manchester, England, and checked into a 3-star hotel. He considered travelling on a false passport. The government sometimes issued special travel and ID documents to important officials who needed to move about discreetly. But although South was technically on government service, he thought it best to act here entirely in a private capacity. In England he found the economic climate every bit as bad as in the United States, if not worse. Increasingly, society everywhere was becoming more and more polarised between the haves and the have-nots. It was ironic that the rhymulator, the greatest invention since the wheel, had been responsible for this. No, it wasn't the rhymulator. It was the financial system and the people who controlled it, in particular Rockman, the Rothstein clan and their satellites. He read all about it, and he was worried that they would do to James Hunter what their predecessors had done to Mr. Lincoln. He was even more worried that if he were not careful, they would do the same thing to himself. South's visit turned out to be extremely fruitful. The tourist who had complained that he had been indecently assaulted by the Professor was named Richard Allen, and in spite of his being on a modest middle-class salary, he was obviously living in a grand style in England. South had obtained a man's address from his friend in the New York Police Department, and hiring a car, he drove out to his house, a detached Victorian mansion standing in 2 acres of its own grounds. He decided against breaking into the house, as this would result in real problems with who were caught. He made a few discreet inquiries of the man's neighbours, posing as an American pressman. He didn't tell them precisely why he was interested in their absent neighbour, but said simply that the man had been involved in an incident in New York in which a senior member of the US government had been acutely embarrassed